So I think we'll get started. Good afternoon. As we are reading the hellos from everybody from across the country and internationally, we're so proud and happy to welcome you today to the official launch and the inaugural special event of the Copenhagen Center for the Advancement of Women in Communications at Stevens College. I can't tell you how excited, you can probably tell how excited and grateful we are here at Stevens to be establishing this formal and collaborative partnership with the Copenhagen Center and the Florida International University.
3, 4, 6, 2, 1.
Hello.
We're all going to get used to Zoom and it'll all be good. There's a little bit of feedback, but if everybody could remember to mute, that would be great. Thank you. Rowan University was actually the first satellite site of the Copenhagen Center, and I just said hello to somebody from Rowan. Stevens College is the second and the first in the Midwest. I am certain, as I keep telling Lillian, that this is just the beginning of what will become a powerful and important network of such sites, all dedicated to the mission and the vision of its founder, Dr. Lillian Lodge Kopenhaver. Dr. Kopenhaver will speak to you in a few moments about that vision and those commitments. But first, I get to share a few things with you about her, and there is so much to share. Dr. Kopenhaver is Dean Emeritus and Professor in the School of Communications and Journalism at Florida International University. A nationally known expert and researcher on the First Amendment, the scholastic and collegiate press, and of course, the role and status of women in communications. She is the author of more than 115 scholarly articles, monographs, and books. She is the past president of the Association for Education in Journalism and Mass Communication, College Media Advisors, the Student Press Law Center, and the Community College Journalism Association. Those of you who have spent any time in your careers or as students in media communications education know that every one of those organizations is incredibly powerful, influential, and important in its own right. And only Lillian could actually have risen to the pinnacle of authority and leadership in every one of those organizations. It's unbelievable, but not if you know Lillian. Dr. Kopenhaver holds the Wells Memorial Key from the Society of Professional Journalists, only the second woman to ever win that award at the time she was awarded. The College Media Advisors Distinguished Service Award, the AJMC Newspaper Division Distinguished Service Award, the AJMC Outstanding Leadership Award, the FIU, Alumni Association Outstanding Faculty Torch Award, and the Distinguished Alumnus Award from Rowan. And that's just to name a few, and I really mean that. She has received extraordinary accolades and thanks from all of the organizations of which she's been a part. Lillian also happens to be a dear friend of mine, a personal inspiration and a professional role model since we met many years ago. The first time I met her, I was a brand new AJMC member and she was the president. And I thought, I'm gonna work with that woman. I'm gonna find a way to collaborate with that woman because she's amazing. Today marks yet another way we are joining forces, Stevens College and the Copenhagen Center at FIU, to empower, celebrate, and promote equity and opportunity for all women in the communications professions, and by extension, all women everywhere. It is with such pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Lillian Lodge Kopenhaver. Oh, you're on mute.
I am. I was just saying, I don't know how I can follow that. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
You're good.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am really so excited to be with you this afternoon as we inaugurate the Satellite Center of the Copenhagen Center at Florida National University here at Stevens College. This is such an amazing opportunity for us to enrich educational opportunities at both institutions that are thousands of miles apart. And as Diane mentioned, we also inaugurated a center at Rowan University in New Jersey in October. So this spreads us across part of the country. And we are tremendously excited about that. Let me tell you a little bit about the Kopenhaver Center. Our mission is to empower both women professionals and academics in all of the fields of communication in order to develop visionaries and leaders who can make a difference in their communities and in their professions. The center offers workshops, webinars, seminars, mentoring, national conferences, and all kinds of other programs throughout the year to provide opportunities for networking and for learning from those who have become leaders in the professions and are sharing their time and expertise to help others. Too frequently, women have not had the confidence and encouragement to envision becoming leaders in whatever profession they are going to be entering. We started our center to try to provide that encouragement and empowerment to young women, to help them realize that they can do it all, that they have the power to realize their dreams, that they can become leaders someday. So having Stevens join us in that mission is exciting. I cannot think of a better partnership to join us with Rowan than President Lynch and her faculty and students, so many of whom are here today, as well as so many alums. So thank you so much, Diane, for that beautiful introduction. I have known you for a long time and have been so impressed with your work, and your leadership at Stevens is really been instrumental in bringing us together to bridge what I think is going to be a wonderful partnership in the times to come. It is now my pleasure to introduce Brian Schreiner, Dean of the College of Communication, Architecture, and the Arts at Florida International University, who has been so supportive of our efforts and has consistently encouraged the Kopenhaver Center in our mission and in spreading our wings to come out to Missouri. Brian?
Thank you, Dr. Kopenhaver. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to take this opportunity first to welcome you and to congratulate Dr. Kopenhaver and Dr. Lynch for their leadership and vision for creating the Kopenhaver Center at Stevens College. Since 2013, the Kopenhaver Center at FIU has been a pioneering organization for the advancement of women in communication. Moreover, for 50 plus years, Dr. Kopenhaver has been a tireless national advocate for women. And I've had the good fortune of calling her a colleague and a friend for over 30 of those years. The vision Dr. Kopenhaver established for the center is to lead the way for future generation of professionals and scholars. So naturally, partnering with Stevens College and President Lynch is a perfect next and important step for the Kopenhaver Center. In thinking about today and launching of the Kopenhaver Center at Stevens College, management expert Tom Peters' wise words came to my mind. He said, quote, "Leaders don't create followers, they create other leaders." Creating other leaders is the primary mission of the Kopenhaver Center and its home institutions, FIU, Rowan, and Stevens. So congratulations. Thank you for permitting me to be part of today's celebration, and I'm looking forward to the lecture.
Thank you, Brian. We're so delighted to be in partnership with the Kopenhaver Center and with you at FIU. Your leadership, I'm so well aware, has made such a difference in the programs and the faculty and the lives of your students. So it is now my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Arola Wedman-Faro, the inaugural director of the Copenhagen Center at Stevens College. When I was thinking about doing this and we had the conversation and I came back to campus and I said, Arola, what do you think about this? And she said, that would be so great. That would be fantastic. And I was like, we got our director. Sure enough, we do. Arola graduated from Stevens with a degree in fashion communication and an emphasis in film. While she was at Stevens, she was the executive editor of Stevens Life magazine. which won multiple national awards, Best Magazine of the Year, for excellence under her leadership, as well as she was also the social media planner for the School of Design. She serves for us as the director of our student-focused creative services agency, The Agency. And as I said, she is the inaugural director of the Copenhagen Center here at Stevens. I'm so grateful for her efforts, her talent, and her energy, because I know she will lead the new Copenhagen Center into its bright and empowering future. Starting with today. Thank you so much, Arola, for your organization, effort, and skill and attention to this amazing, wonderful event. And I will now turn it over to you so you can introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, President Lynch, Dr. Kopenhaver, and Dean Schreiner for your remarks. First, I want to let the audience know that we will have a Q&A at the end of the session. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please type those in the chat and we will get to them in the end. And moving on, I want to say that I am very grateful that I got to work with our Stevens team and our FIU team on the inauguration of the Copenhagen Center at Stevens. I can't wait to see the impact that these connections, these workshops, and speakers will have in our community. And talking about speakers, it is my honor to introduce our inaugural speaker, Daniella Saltzman. Daniella is a Vietnamese-American documentary photographer. She is a National Geographic photographer and grantee, a multiple grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, a fellow with the International Women's Media Foundation, and the founder of Women Photograph. Daniella's work tends to focus on the legacies of Western colonization, from the rise of homophobia in East Africa to the forced assimilation education of Indigenous children in North America. Her ongoing project, Signs of Your Identity, is the recipient of numerous awards, including the 2017 Arnold Newman Prize and the 2017 Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award. Please use your hands or your Zoom reactions and join me in welcoming Daniella Saltzman.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. Congratulations to the Copenhagen Center, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Daniella. I'm a documentary photographer based between Paris and New York. And today I'm going to walk through my career as a photojournalist and some of the long-term projects that I've been working on. I thought this was going to be almost exclusively students, and so I realized this is a more diverse crowd than I was planning for. So I will try not to be as pedantic as I sometimes can be in my talks. But I'm just going to share my screen quickly so that you all can follow along with the work. All right, can everyone see this? Perfect.
Yes.
So I am originally from the Washington, DC area, as Arola mentioned, and I have wanted to be a journalist since I was about 12 years old. And as a kid, journalism meant newspapers. And so in my mind, I decided that I needed to get to New York City, which is the capital of the media empire in the United States. And that was going to be how I sort of carved out my path as a journalist. And so I ended up going to Columbia University, where I studied architecture, which is a totally different talk. But while I was there, the first sort of act on arriving to campus was to join the undergraduate student newspaper, the Columbia Daily Spectator. Oops, I'm having a, okay. And one of the first open doors that I experienced was being, I'd started out actually wanting to be a writer. I started out believing that I wanted to be a newspaper journalist for my entire career. And thanks to a few serendipitous accidents, which has been a theme of my entire life and my entire career, while I was a sophomore, the then president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, came and spoke at my university. The entire campus shut down, security was very tight. And so the New York Daily News, a large tabloid in New York City, reached out to the student newspaper and said, hey, we need someone to photograph this for us because we're not able to get our own photographers in. And even though at the time I was really more of a writer and I was working on the news desk, I said, sure, I can absolutely do that. So I took the assignment, having very little practical experience in photojournalism. And this was the front page of the Daily News the next day. And that kind of became the launching point for my work. I started freelancing very regularly for the New York Daily News. I skipped most of my classes. I would say to all the students here, please don't do that. Please go to your classes, especially if you're enrolled in a communications program. But I had very understanding professors, and by the end, by my senior year of college, I was working 4 to 5 days a week for the Daily News. And the thing that I loved most about being a newspaper photographer is that you have to be a generalist. So you don't get to say, oh, I'm only interested in politics or I'm only interested in fashion. You have to cover everything. And especially when you're the young newbie in the photo team, you get sent to some of the gnarliest assignments. So I really got to know every corner of New York City. I covered building collapses and crime scenes and fires and all sorts of situations. I would go from a press conference in the morning to a Fashion Week show in the afternoon to a baseball game in the evening. And it's really where I learned to become a photographer. It's where I learned to become a journalist. It was just, it was a trade that I learned by doing. Towards the end of my time in college was the 2008 presidential campaign. And again, through another pretty serendipitous accident, I ended up working with one of the larger Swiss French language newspapers on the campaign trail. So I covered the New Hampshire primary and the Pennsylvania primary and the South Carolina primary, and ended up spending the first 2 weeks of my senior year of college at the DNC and the RNC, where I was photographing soon to be President Barack Obama and current President Joe Biden. In New York, I continued to cover everything from sports, so bull riding at Madison Square Garden, youth baseball, Fashion Week, which I covered every single season. I know nothing about either sports or fashion, so neither of these were my forte, but again, if you're a newspaper photographer, you do it all. And so that was more or less the first 5 years of my career, running around New York City, freelancing primarily for the New York Daily News and the Wall Street Journal, covering every kind of story you can imagine. And part of me loved it. And I am still, I'm really glad that that was sort of my introduction to photography, that was my training as a photographer. But I started to get to know myself better as both a journalist and a storyteller. And I started to realize that my strength is being a deep empath. And I'm the kind of person who sits down with strangers and immediately gets to know them deeply. I sit down with people and they tell me their deepest, darkest secrets within minutes. And I love that. And I love doing that. But it was a little frustrating and a little exhausting to be doing that in the context of newspaper photography, because the best and worst thing about newspapers is it's a 24-hour news cycle. And you have to put out a newspaper every single day. And you have to publish stories for that newspaper every single day. And so I would be going through that process 5 times a day for assignments that lasted from 15 minutes to 3 hours with someone who I would sit down with and get to know on some kind of intimate level and photograph them and try to tell a story that was, deeply about their soul. And then I'd have to say, goodbye, I'm off to the next story. Nice meeting you. And I realized pretty quickly, this doesn't feel fulfilling to me. I think I would rather spend weeks or months or maybe even years on projects. But also I'm a 22, 23-year-old photojournalist. No one is going to send me to work on month-long projects. So I need to figure out how to engineer this for myself. And so I started thinking about alternative models for photojournalism. And, unfortunately, maybe 50 years ago, it was feasible for newspapers and magazines to send their photographers on assignments for months at a time. And there are still a couple that do it, but not very many anymore. Just unfortunately, because of the attention span that we all hold as audience and just the budgets that a lot of media outlets have now. And so I would just save up money. I was working as a waitress and a bartender and as a freelance web developer. And so I would sort of scrape together some savings and take about a month of each year that I was working as a press photographer in New York and go and travel somewhere and work on a project. And we can have an entirely separate conversation about the problematic undercurrents of me thinking that I needed to travel abroad or go somewhere else foreign to be a journalist. That's a different TED Talk. But in the meantime, one of the first places that I went to in 2011 was the independence of South Sudan. It's our youngest nation, and a colleague of mine and I decided that was a really momentous occasion that we should try to save up and go and see what was happening. And so we took about a month and we went to East Africa. And on our way, we had to spend a week in Kampala, the capital of Uganda, while we waited for our visas to process. And I didn't want to waste my time there. It was my first time in Africa, my first time in Uganda. And so I literally just Googled news, Uganda, what's happening, trying to get a sense of what was going on. And one of the first stories that came up was the fact that the first openly gay Ugandan, the first LGBTQ rights activist in Uganda, had been murdered just a few months prior. And so I reached out to the LGBTQ activism community. I made contact, I started photographing, and that led to what became a 4-year-long project following the evolution of this anti-gay law that went through Parliament and was briefly legalized in Uganda. And that also became the beginning of me starting to think about how I wanted to function as a storyteller. You know, my background, as Arola mentioned, is I'm half Vietnamese. I'm also the descendant of Eastern European Jewish immigrants. Thinking about colonialism and the ways in which Western colonization impact us and the structures that we exist within has always been a huge part of my identity. And one of the things that I noticed first about the story happening in Uganda with this anti-gay law that was getting quite a bit of press and traction in Western media was that there was this very scolding quality in a lot of the coverage. And it was this sense of, oh God, you know, it's so backwards. How could they? How could a law like this possibly be on the books? And, you know, yes, there are 88 countries throughout the world who in some way still criminalize sexual minorities, and that is terrible. And that is something that we need to work to change. But at the time when I started working on this project, the United States had still not legalized marriage equality. So, you know, we were still on our own journey. And also, if we look at the actual root of homophobia and anti-gay laws in East Africa, that's rooted in Western presence. That's, you know, that's originally from a British penal code that was left behind when the Brits colonized Uganda and was exacerbated by American evangelicals who came shortly after Idi Amin was deposed in the 80s. So we tend to forget, I think, and in reflecting on my own education in, you know, middle and high school, we tend to very much disassociate ourselves from our own colonial histories. We tend not to understand just because it is so overpowering, it is so dominant. We don't necessarily see just how much they impact the structures we exist in, whether that's social or political or economic. And so that kind of set the tone for me of how I wanted to work, was to not just talk about the stories that I was documenting, the moments, the individuals, but to think about the wider context and the history behind some of these issues, because it's very easy sometimes for us to dissociate and to forget what came before. So from Uganda, because of that work, which was funded by a DC nonprofit called the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, I ended up going to Australia to speak at the International AIDS Conference. And students often ask me, where do you get ideas for your projects? How do they come to you? And the truth is they're almost always serendipitous accidents. But I think this is, you know, the only piece of advice I can really give is just to always be curious, to always read, to always question why things are the way they are. And so when I was at this conference, I gave a talk about how when we criminalize sexual minorities, when we criminalize gay people, there's almost always a public health consequence. So, you know, you put in an anti-gay law into place and gay people don't feel safe going to the hospital, going to the doctor, going to seek prophylactics. So you almost always see a spike in HIV rates. And so I gave a talk about that. And I happened to be reading a UN AIDS report. And there was a single line in that report that referenced the fact that the group of people in the world with the fastest growing rate of HIV was First Nations Canadians or Indigenous Canadians. I am not an expert in public health, but that seemed pretty fishy to me. And that was that little spark that made me think there's something strange here that doesn't quite line up with what I know. And, you know, I mean, I think most of us here are American. We know that our neighbors to the north have a slightly more evolved healthcare system. It's nationalized. If you need medicine or access to a doctor or access to a hospital, it is very cheap or free. And yet there's this group of people who had been almost entirely left behind. You know, in a 2-year period, HIV rates had gone up by about 25%, which is a full-on epidemic. And so I went to the Pulitzer Center again, and I said, here, I have the story. I think I'd really like to go investigate. And I spent about a month driving across Canada from British Columbia on the West Coast to Saskatchewan in the Plains to Ontario on the East Coast. And I interviewed about 50 HIV positive First Nations adults about their experiences, about their stories and their histories. And even though this wasn't the story that I was there to tell, every single person I met told me about their time in Indian boarding school. And I'm sorry that I can't see all of you right now to get sort of a hand raised gauge. And I'd be curious to hear how many of you have heard of Indian boarding schools or Indian residential schools. It's not something that I learned about growing up in the DC area, going to university in New York. It was never part of my classes of history that I learned. But starting in the 1870s in Canada, the government created this network of boarding schools that was meant to forcibly assimilate Indigenous youth into the dominant white culture. And they were mandatory by law, and a government employee called an Indian agent would come to Native communities and would effectively kidnap all of the children under the age of 16 or so, sometimes as young as 2 years old. And they would take these children away from their parents, away from their families, and send them off to these boarding schools where they would sometimes be for 10 years at a time without being able to go home and see their families. And they were beaten if they spoke their language. They were not allowed to practice their culture in any capacity. There was rampant physical and sexual assault. There was medical testing performed on children. There was sterilization of young women. And the last one of those schools in Canada didn't close until 1996. So, I was born in 1986. I met people who were my age who had gone to these schools. Had I been born Indigenous in specific parts of Canada, I could have very well ended up with the same fate. In the United States, we have a system that has changed slightly. They no longer are what they once were 50, 75 years ago, but we still have Indian boarding schools operated by the government in the United States. So, on my first trip through Canada, I was thinking as a news photographer, because that was my training, that was my background. And so I was photographing what I saw, which was communities in mostly urban centers who were deeply impacted by HIV. And in urban communities, HIV is primarily spread through injection drug use. And that is particularly connected to the opioid crisis that we're seeing across North America right now. And so I came home with a body of work that, you can probably imagine was a lot of people dealing with addiction and opioids and injection drug use. And I realized these were bad photographs. It wasn't good journalism. It wasn't good photography. It wasn't going to advance any kind of narrative. It wasn't going to help my audience understand this history that I was just starting to understand as an outsider. And so I needed to go back. And so I went back to the Pulitzer Center and I said, I'm so sorry. I kind of messed up. I thought the story was this thing, but it turns out that's just one symptom of this much larger thing. Can you give me more money? Can I go back and do it again? And, luckily I had an established relationship with them and they said, oh, okay, crazy lady, go do your thing. And they were very kind about it, thankfully. And so I went back. And so, if you've been looking at these images and haven't been able to quite figure out what's been going on, these are actually all double exposures. So they are portraits of boarding school survivors, and there are still 80,000 alive in Canada, superimposed with the sights and the memories of their boarding school experiences. So, it was one of the first moments where I felt documentary photography is such a powerful tool, and I believe in it so deeply, but it also has its limitations. And as a medium, I think photography has, as an art form, evolved so much less than equivalent art forms that exist around it. Photography now is pretty much the same as when we invented it over 100 years ago. And I think, we've had these ethical practices and these standards that we put into place for very good reasons, but we also have the space to question them and question the ways in which we are photographers. So this was one of the first times where I thought, there are limitations to this medium and the way it works, and it doesn't fit the story. Because some of the things that I want to talk about are intergenerational trauma and cultural genocide, and the ways in which things that happen to us as children continue to impact us as adults, impact our children, impact our grandchildren, and a still photograph just wasn't enough. So that was sort of my first foray into alternative process as a photographer. So another project to do a complete 180 that I've worked on for about 5 years now is looking at the narrative of the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe. So, I've been based in Europe since 2012, and I haven't really considered myself a news photographer since I moved to Europe. I'm not really a reactive photographer anymore. I don't cover breaking news. It's something that I did at the start of my career. Again, I'm very grateful for that experience, but it doesn't really guide the way I think about visual storytelling. That being said, it was hard to be someone who identifies still as a journalist in Europe when this was such a dominant narrative, starting in 2014, 2015. And, as someone who has distantly people in her family who have come to America as refugees, it was very frustrating to see some of the narrative around Syrian refugees coming to Europe. One of people who were intent on malice, people who were looking for handouts, when truthfully, it was a group of people who were seeking to get away from tremendous violence and just rebuild new lives in a better place. And so a colleague of mine and I decided to go to Calais, which is a small port town in France, sort of the closest entry point to England from France, where a refugee camp had sprung up. And I think at its height, there were something like 15,000 people living there in some of the worst living conditions I have ever encountered. And I didn't really have any particular mission or story or narrative in mind when I went. I just knew that I wanted to see what was happening and see if there was a way I could slightly humanize the experience, because I knew just how grueling it was for Syrian refugees to make it all the way from their home overland across Turkey, take a small boat across the Mediterranean to Greece, and then travel overland to whatever destination they chose. We had seen images of just how grueling that was, but we didn't really understand who the people were. And so literally the first person I met is this young man here named Hassam. He's my age. He's also born in 1986. And, he didn't speak a ton of English, and I speak even less Arabic, but we spent about 4 or 5 days together, and I would follow him in the evening when he tried to get into the Eurotunnel or get onto trucks or get onto boats getting to England, because he decided that that was the place where he wanted to go, where he could be happiest. And part of me was really proud of the work because it was complicated access and it wasn't something that I had seen yet before. I was, spending these crazy long overnights hiding from the police and, running with him and several friends as they tried to evade law enforcement. But at the same time, I realized I was covering such a small fraction of his journey. He had traveled something like 1,500 miles to get to this point, and I was here just covering the very, very end of it. And so again, it was one of those moments where I kind of felt my failings as a journalist. There were things that I knew I could do, with things that I also recognized I really couldn't. But Hassam also started showing me his own photos, and he had taken this incredible copious number of selfies on the refugee trail. He's a millennial. He had a cell phone. It's, it's sort of the lingua franca of my generation. And so the more time we spent together, he started pulling out his phone and showing me, oh, this is what it was like when I was sleeping at the train station in Croatia. This is what it was like when I was detained briefly in Germany. This is what it was like when I was on a boat in the middle of the Mediterranean, thinking that the boat was going to sink and I was going to die. And so we decided that we were actually going to co-publish a piece together, because it was only through both his images and mine that we could tell a complete story. And, I just think this is so indicative of, we have everything here, from the experience of walking with hundreds and hundreds of people down highways trying to make it to a border checkpoint. If you see in the first photo, that's his cousin over, his left shoulder, to literally being on a lifeboat, to just, coming across the Eiffel Tower and taking a touristy photo, because that's also an instinct that we all have as humans. And so that story published. I collaborated with a photo editor who I've worked with my entire career, who understands the way I work and trusts me. So from there, another 180. I think as someone who has spent a huge percent of the better part of the last decade working in Indigenous communities and thinking about Indigenous issues and that history in the United States in particular, I also think it's important to look at the flip side of that dynamic, of that history of oppression, of genocide. And one of the things that I started thinking about more and more as I was spending time in Native communities was the way in which we have come to casually appropriate Native identity and culture without really questioning it, in a way that I think we would not with Black culture, with Asian culture, with Latin American culture, because there is a significantly larger population with which someone can say, hey, actually, that's not cool. Please don't do that. And I think one of the most obvious and overlooked ways in which that manifests itself is in athletics and in mascots. And as someone who grew up in DC and never really thought to question the Washington football team former name that just only recently changed, I think that alone, as someone who thinks about these things for a living, it's easy to see how blind we can be to the ways in which we express racism and oppression in our everyday lives. So, I'd started doing some research, and I was thinking really about the root of this ideology. And, I think the root of everything in both good and bad ways is often youth, right? Because, it's a group of people who are at their most empathetic. And it's why I love speaking to university and high school students, because I think you all are at a point where you are most enthusiastic about affecting change and figuring out how we can make the world a better place. But it's also an easy way to kind of unintentionally indoctrinate people as well, right? It's the reason why young children were taken away from their families and sent off to these boarding schools, because they could have the slate wiped clean. They could be essentially disassociated and severed from their own culture, their own identity. And so I started reading more about high school mascots in the United States, and I learned that actually there were more than 1,000 high schools across America that still had some variation of a Native themed mascot. And some of them were horrible racial slurs, and some of them were a little more, you know, middle ground chiefs or braves or Indians or different tribal names. But either way, it was invoking a culture that didn't really make any sense, that wasn't really connected to the school. And so I did a little more research, and I learned that Ohio actually had the highest number of Native mascots of any state in the US. And so I spent a couple weeks visiting different middle schools and high schools and photographing students and interviewing them and the athletic directors and the principals at their schools, and trying to have conversations about whether there was any movement to change or evolve. And in almost every single case, there wasn't, because, you know, Ohio has virtually no Indigenous community anymore. I think it's 0.3% of the population of Ohio is Native. So, you know, I would ask people, well, has there ever been any pushback? Has anyone ever tried to say that we should change the name? And they go, well, no, of course not. And I say, well, have you ever had a Native student in your school? And they go, well, no, of course not. So, you know, I think there's a pretty strong correlation there. And then, of course, you know, when we sanction and ignore these things when we're young, then it's easier to grow up to be an adult sports fan who roots for Chief Wahoo and the Cleveland Indians, or the Washington football team, which is named for a very obvious racial slur. So I think, you know, this project, which ended up becoming a National Geographic story, looked at sort of the root of those appropriations and what exactly our responsibility is as Americans to think more carefully about those things. This is actually, as a side story, this is sort of one of the first things when I started writing this pitch for Nat Geo was I thought of this man because you know, as a kid, my parents had a beach house in Bethany Beach, Delaware. And I remember at the entrance to that town, there was this giant totem pole. And I had always thought as a kid, oh, that's kind of cool. I wonder, you know, that must have been from a Native tribe that had existed in this region long ago. And I only, as an adult, did some research and realized, wait, when I started working in the Pacific Northwest, I realized only Pacific Northwest tribes make totem poles. This is only native to a very specific region of North America. Why was there one in Delaware? And I learned that there was actually a Czech sculptor who had come to the United States and became fascinated with Native Americans. And so he started making these large Native heads and totem poles that he erected in every single state in the United States. And so, you know, even if the intent is meant to honor, which I think is often the argument for sports mascots, it is still a complicated conversation. So I was very glad to be able to work on that. And then I'll just wrap up with this project before I move on to sort of the more community organizing work. A friend of mine who I was in an exhibition with a couple of years ago named Dred Scott in a far more fine art and performance art capacity, works as a photographer. And he had done a bunch of research into the largest slave rebellion in US history. It was called the German Coast Uprising. It took place in 1811. And similar to the history of Native boarding schools, we don't really talk about slave uprisings in the United States all that much. But, you know, as often as we address slavery, as much as there was slavery, hand in hand with that was constant slave uprisings of people who were fighting back, who were trying to escape. And so he gathered about 300 Native Louisianans, which is where the German Coast Uprising took place, and researched period dress and got them together and did a full reenactment of this 2-day uprising that took place down the coast through several parishes and then down into New Orleans. And I was able to photograph that. This was November of 2019, one of the last assignments I worked on before the world went to hell. And again, this was a story that, from his perspective as the performance artist, as the person who was carrying out this project, was thinking about futurism as well. And so I loved being able to photograph it because for him, obviously this particular uprising was ultimately unsuccessful. All of the people who took part were executed, many without trial. But he ended this particular weekend with sort of a larger question of what if this had been successful? What if there had been a slightly different version of US history for enslaved Black people? And I think, you know, even though obviously that falls slightly outside the bounds of reality and journalism, I think creating space for those kinds of questions and those kinds of applications of photography are deeply important as well. And so the last thing I want to talk about, I'm sorry, I've totally lost track of time. Am I okay?
Yes, you are good on time.
Great, perfect. So now I want to shift a little bit to some of the community organizing that I do. I have spent the last 4 years working on a nonprofit called Women Photograph, which I started in 2017. And I know that I don't need to tell this audience about this, but just to give some broader context, 85% of working news photographers are men. And I think we as journalists, for the better part of the existence of our industry, have told ourselves that we are these third-party, unbiased, objective storytellers, and we witness life as it happens, and we tell those stories, and we are just completely emotionally disassociated from the work that we do. And I think only just now, only very recently, have we started to have conversations about, well, maybe that's actually not true. Maybe our lived experiences, maybe our identities deeply impact how we move through the world, how we interact with other people, how we think about and retell other people's stories. And so it becomes deeply toxic and dangerous and damaging when we are almost only hearing about stories and seeing stories through the eyes of male, largely Western photojournalists. And so Women Photograph began as a database, primarily as a hiring resource for photo editors and curators and art directors. We've now grown to just over 1,000 women and non-binary visual journalists based in about 110 countries around the world. We're also a grant-making organization. We've given out about $150,000 worth of project grants. We have an annual mentorship program. We have an annual skills building workshop. We also collect data on hiring and publishing statistics within the industry, because I find when having these conversations, when saying, no, actually identity matters, it's deeply important to think about, is someone an insider? Is someone going to be able to gain access to this community? Is someone going to have a particular perspective on this history that they will know more about and they will be able to address with more nuance? We wanted to create as many resources as possible to both empower storytellers who are working to get into the field, like many of the people watching now, I hope, and also to be able to assist those gatekeepers and those people in positions of power with expanding the photographers and the people they're turning to for work. So I think I speak very quickly, and I apologize for that. I may have gone a little short, and so I can continue to ramble, but I would love to open it up for questions, because I hope that there are quite a few cool conversations that we can have as a group.
Yes, absolutely. That's perfect. Lita, if you can help me put us on gallery mode.
I'll stop sharing.
At this point, I want to begin the Q&A session. So if you have a question, you can type it on the chat, or just type, I have a question, and then we will unmute you so that you can ask Daniella directly, because there's a lot of people, so I might not see everyone if you raise your hand, but just type it on the chat and we will get to you. To get us started and give everyone a couple of minutes to type their question, I would like to start. So Daniella, we got to see examples of your photojournalistic work that still has a very creative quality to it, whether it was the double exposures or your collaboration with Hassam. So what does your creative process look like? How do you combine journalism with creative exploration?
I love that question. I think the thing that I always think about is, we do have such regimented, codified ethical standards in photojournalism, and those are there for a good reason. But my caveat for students and my personal code is always, rules are made to be broken. And as long as we do that with full transparency, as long as we have our own personal moral codes and we are doing things in the spirit of telling the truth, of sharing stories, I think there are a lot of things about those ethical codes that are meant to be questioned and need to evolve. And any set of laws, regulations, rules is meant to evolve. And so when it comes to the actual manipulation of images, obviously don't take a news photograph and then Photoshop something out and alter the meaning of that photo. That categorically, do not do that ever. But if you are going to do something that uses manipulation, the double exposure portraits from Signs of Your Identity, that's very clear image manipulation. As long as you can be completely transparent and clear about your process, about why you made the decisions you did, I think that's completely reasonable. And there are still plenty of people in my industry who will say that's not photojournalism, that you can't publish that in an editorial capacity. And that's fine. I think it's totally that person's prerogative to believe that. But I feel like as long as I am being moral with my use of photography and I'm telling people exactly what I'm doing, that I'm in the right as well.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Again, I still haven't seen any questions in the chat. I'm checking the chat. So if you have any questions, just let us know so we can unmute you. I want to ask you, because for those who were not here at the beginning of the conversation, I got to hear that Daniella is based in Paris, and I love that. So I just wanted to ask you about your decision to move and any photo projects that you might be considering doing in France that you can talk about.
You know, I haven't actually worked all that much in France. I've been based in Europe for the past 8+ years, actually, because of my partner, who is a staff sports writer for the Wall Street Journal. I spend probably 10 to 11 months of each year, when it's not a pandemic, I spend 10 to 11 months of every year on the road. When I lived in the UK, I did have several running projects that I worked on while I was there. I looked at off-grid communities, both in Scotland and in England. I documented World War II reenactors for quite a while, just because I found I had this deep affinity for that community, because I grew up in the DC area where Civil War reenactment is very popular, and it's a very different sort of emotional act in the UK. And there was something that I was drawn to about that. But you know, my French it's getting there, but it's not fluent enough for me to feel like I can work in the ways that I like to in Paris yet.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. Chase has a question. I am going to see if I can unmute you.
Yes, awesome. I teach here at Stevens, and we have a wonderful body of photographers coming through. And so I'm really curious about your mentorship programs and stuff like that from there. So I'll touch base on that. But I'm curious too, is like, what are some of the things that you would recommend the students have, you know, in their pocket, in their toolkit coming out of school? You know, I was like analog, transitioned into digital. I have both those. I love that, but it's also, here we are. I see a lot of students wanting to go back and, like, you know, get into the analog version of photography with film and things like this. I also see people that are just like, want to abandon that completely. Do you have any advice for students making decisions based on which direction would be the most useful for them?
Ooh, well, when it comes to the technical side, no, because I didn't study photography. I have no formal background. I can't light anything to save my life. I do love film photography. That was the one thing I did in college. I took one film class because I thought, if I am going to be a photographer, I need to understand on some fundamental level how this craft evolved. But I also, you know, I think there are photographers where you can look at an image and say, oh, that's that photographer's work, because they have such a distinct style. I think with me, my work shifts and morphs so much depending on the story, and I really fit the medium to the story that I'm trying to tell. So I have zero technical advice. I think the things that I say to students often are, A, figure out what kind of stories you want to tell. And, you know, whatever you have to do, whatever side hustle you need to get yourself to that point to fund that work, do it. It doesn't matter if you have to photograph weddings or graduation portraits or be a bartender. Do what you need to do, but make sure you are always steering yourself towards doing the kind of work that matters most to you. You know, I do a lot of portfolio reviews and mentorships for sort of younger photographers, and very often I'll sit down with a photographer and they'll show me this beautiful, beautiful portfolio of food photography. And I'll go, oh, that's so cool. Do you want to be a food photographer? And they'll go, no. And I'll go, okay, but why are you showing me this work? You show me the work that you want to get hired to do. You know, I think that's the most important thing, is you have to constantly be pushing yourself in sort of an aspirational direction, even if you have to find other ways to pay your rent.
That's great. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Now we have Elizabeth Horney. I think I was just able to unmute you. Can you talk?
Yeah.
Awesome, go ahead.
Right. Sorry, I know it's rude to ask about money, but like, as somebody who just wants to spend their entire life traveling, how do you manage it?
No, okay. So first of all, I don't think it's weird at all. I think we do a really bad job of talking honestly about money in photojournalism, and we need to be better, because it's all very mystified and confusing, and you have to do it for years to figure it out on your own. And you're running an independent business, because all of us are now independent freelancers, and you have to do your taxes and figure out all these crazy things. So no, I don't think someone just muted me. I think we have to have much more transparent conversations about money in photojournalism. I primarily fund my projects through nonprofit journalism foundations and their grants. So I would say 70% of my projects have been funded by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, Open Society Foundations, National Geographic Foundation, and the Magnum Foundation. So those are 4 really great organizations that put a lot of money into funding journalism. And there are so, I think as much as it feels like the floor is falling out from underneath us right now in journalism, and a lot of small outlets are closing and a lot of outlets have less and less money in their budgets, I think at the same time, there are also a lot of secondary models that are coming up, Report for America and the Economic Hardship Project. And there are all these great nonprofits that are coming in and starting to fill that void. So it can feel frustrating and discouraging at times, I think, but there is funding out there if you are creative with how you go about finding it. And, again, like I said, when you're starting out, no shame in the side hustle. Do what you got to do to pay your rent and take care of your overhead. And, your first ever project, you're probably not going to get funded, and that's okay. Don't let that discourage you. You just sometimes have to go out and make the work, and then you can show photo editors and other nonprofit funders, like, look, I can do this. I have this work now. That project that I got funded in Uganda, I got it funded by the Pulitzer Center, but only for the second trip. That first trip, I fully funded myself, but then I had that connection to the LGBTQ activist community there. And 7 months later, when the anti-gay law was passed in Parliament, I was able to go to the Pulitzer Center and say, hey, I know this story. I know all of the players. I know all of these activists. They trust me. I have a connection. I've already done some of the work. Now give me some money to go back and do more. And that was sort of my entry point into being able to sort of be someone who had rapport and trust.
Excellent.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. We have Kristen Loveland now.
Hello. Where do you see the future of photojournalism going? Is it a sustainable career? Because with like cell phones, and I know a lot of news outlets just go to people's Facebook page and pull off the pictures and things like that. So where do you see, they're pretty lazy. Photojournalism now, there's a lot of lazy ones, right? Where do you see it going with cell phones?
I'm not worried. I think there are plenty of people in my industry who are worried, who are alarmists with each, new advancement in technology, who were very concerned when photographic technology became more accessible and more democratic. And to me, that's only a good thing, right? It means that more people and more different types of people will be able to become photojournalists. But the thing is, we consume more photography than we ever have before. We consume an insane amount of visual imagery. We just haven't totally figured out in the journalism industry how to properly capitalize on that and how to properly monetize it. We've given a lot of it away for free, newspapers, magazines, but we're working on it. We'll figure it out eventually. There are all of these alternative models that are popping up. And we're always going to need photos, and we're always going to need good, ethical, well-sourced photos too. I think there is absolutely a role for and a need for sort of the crowdsourced photograph of, there's some incredible breaking news situation and there is no photojournalist on site. So you do get smartphone photos that become viral because that person was in the right spot at the right time or the wrong place at the wrong time. But I don't think that will ever replace, the people who are sort of at the upper echelon of this career. We will always need good, thoughtful, empathetic photojournalists. So it doesn't concern me, but I think the thing to think about more is how do we make ourselves needed? How do we make ourselves central and useful and necessary?
Thank you.
Thank you. Christy Rice has, let's see, I'm asking to unmute, has a similar question too, but I will unmute you as well, Christy, and you can add to the previous question.
Yes, you spoke a little to this. I was curious as to how you see women in media communications evolving over the next 5 years.
I think we're in a renaissance right now. I think we are in this amazing time of, for the first moment, really structurally as an industry, we are having deep conversations and transparent conversations about the fact that identity matters, about the fact that we need to think about the role of insider storytellers versus outsider storytellers, that gender and race and religion and socioeconomic class impact how we see and how we take photographs. So I can't imagine, there are these women photojournalists who came before me who are now in their 50s, 60s, 70s. I cannot imagine how frustrating and tough and just rip your hair out, enraging it was at moments for them in their career to be fighting some of these things that are now easier and more normalized conversations. We still have a long way to go. We still do not have an equitable industry. We still have a lot of systems within photojournalism that perpetuate colonialism, that perpetuate misogyny and sexism and racism, but it's better than it's ever been before. And I think we are pushing with such momentum that it is only going to continue to get better. And that feels really exciting.
Wonderful, thanks.
Thank you. We have Karen Brager, which has a question about equipment. And I'm trying to find Karen to unmute her. Let's see. Lita, if you find her before me, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. So hello. So I wanted to ask, just in terms of the equipment that you bring along, not necessarily which equipment are you using, but in other words, when you're sneaking on a refugee trail, or, you're out in the wild, and are you bringing along like large equipment, or are you using your cell phone as backup? Just kind of what's the, from the equipment perspective, not exactly what you're using, but I just kind of think that might be a little daunting as you're trying to travel light or extreme conditions. So I'm curious about that.
So I almost always only travel with what I can fit in a backpack. If I can't get it on my bag and I can't run with everything I have, it's not coming with me, because I'm not someone who works in studio. I'm not doing, big production shoots with lights and assistants and tripods. If it's not going to fit in something that I can move quickly with, just as someone who has that sort of photojournalist training and started out running around New York City without a car, having to take the subway everywhere to get to my assignments, that's my philosophy. So I usually have one digital body, one film camera, my phone, a handful of lenses, and that's usually what I have on me. I like to be as mobile as possible.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Let's see, we have Natalie LaRoche. No. Thank you all for your patience. I'm scrolling through all of our participants to find the person with the question and unmute them.
Hi, I was just wondering, when you think of a story, do you immediately have a gut feeling of whether the story is going to be successful or a failure maybe? And how do you manage your self-doubt when it comes to stories?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it depends on what your own personal metric is for success or failure, right? So unfortunately, we live in an era where a lot of news media outlets categorize success by audience engagement. And while sometimes, and to some extent, I understand that it's not always a good metric, right? Because sometimes the hard, unpleasant stories, I like to think about my work as being the spinach of photojournalism. Like, you might not like it, but it's good for you, and I'm going to feed you spinach anyway. So that tends not to matter so much to me. Whether or not an image gets a ton of Instagram likes or gets a lot of people clicking on it or sharing it, that's not as much of a metric for me as, do I think this is something people need to hear? Will it change their perspective on something important? Will it allow them to feel more empathy for a specific person or group or situation? So those aren't always questions that you can really answer and gauge, which can be really frustrating and lonely as a journalist who wants to know, like, is my work having impact? Does it matter? Does it make a difference? And so I think sometimes you just have to steel yourself and say, no, I believe in the work. I believe in getting this story, this message, this narrative out in the world, and hope that there will be some kind of feedback cosmically at some point to let you know that you're going in the right direction. And was there another part to your question?
I just asked how you manage the self-doubt that sometimes comes with your project.
So two things, because we are having a conversation about women in media. I think that we have socialized women to experience self-doubt on a much deeper, more fundamental existential level than we have socialized men to experience self-doubt. And that's unfortunate and something that we need to work as a society to change. And the other half of it is that I experience it all the time. I'm constantly riddled with self-doubt. And to some extent, I also believe if you ever get to a point in your career where you think, I'm nailing it, I'm getting it all right, I'm doing a great job, that's when I think, oh, you've settled in and you're going to stop thinking things through. And that's when you're not like really questioning the core of what you're doing. So I think a little self-doubt is good. I think that keeps you on your toes. It keeps you just constantly reassessing your value system and the ways in which you're working. But crippling self-doubt, obviously bad. So, we have to try to work through that and just have like that good balance of just like a little bit of self-doubt, I think.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. President Lynch, you are next.
So I used to be a journalist, so I always have a question. I'm interested in who you follow on Instagram and who, to whom do you look and to whom should our students look in terms of the best and brightest, the most interesting, perhaps the most honest photojournalists today?
Oh, that's a great question. Because I didn't study photography, because I don't have a great, especially early on, I didn't have as much of a grounding in sort of the history of photography and some of the, the greats that I think a lot of photo students are taught to worship and study and emulate. I think a lot of the people who have inspired me most have been my peers. And so the people who immediately come to mind are Hannah Reyes-Morales and Evgenia Arbogeva. I can type some of these into the chat. And Erica Larson, and Natalie Kezar, and Yagazie Emezi, Ida Mulina. I think I've realized I've just listed off a bunch of women, which is perfect. But it really, I think it's a lot of my contemporaries who I think are visionary, are working in revolutionary ways, are questioning the ways in which we use photography as a storytelling tool. Those and the people who I also turn to when I have, ethical questions, who are sort of my ethical North Stars.
We would love that list.
I'll type them into the chat.
Thank you. As you do that, I will unmute Noah.
Hello. I'm wondering, what do you see as the role of higher education in preparing future photojournalists and storytellers? What can institutions of higher education do both in the classroom and outside the classroom to help bring up the next generation of ethical and honest and deeply thoughtful photojournalists?
Oh, I love that question. It's a little hard for me to answer it fully because I didn't study photography. I haven't gone to journalism or communication school. But what I feel like I can say as someone who does a lot of teaching within the broader photojournalism community is that a lot of people who studied photography, I think, are not always prepared to function in the world as independent contractors, as people who are running their own businesses. I think a lot of people who may currently be in positions as tenured professors worked in the industry maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, possibly have a very different, maybe worked at small town newspapers and then graduated to a big city newspaper. And that was sort of the very common trajectory that a lot of photographers took back in the day. And that's not really open to us anymore. And so I think, I'm an adjunct professor at Wake Forest University, and I speak to a lot of students there, and they have a really good grasp of the conversations around ethics. They have they have access to all these conversations around technical skills that they need, but they don't know how to incorporate as an LLC when they start their business. They don't know how to do all of these very specific sort of financial business things that I think are really important and kind of determine whether or not you can keep yourself afloat, especially in those first few years when it's really tough to establish yourself as a freelancer. So, talking about how do you pitch a photo editor? How do you write a grant application? Some of these more like practical survival skills that I think also we have kind of up until recently been really closely guarded secrets. That I think one of the beautiful things about all of these community spaces that are being built in photojournalism is that people are sharing more and more resources and are leaning on each other more heavily. We've kind of historically had this lone wolf approach to photojournalism, that we're all on our own and we're all in competition with each other, and so we can't help each other out, and that either as a group of students who graduate together or in different affinity groups like Women Photograph or Diversify Photo, I think we're starting to see that we're all stronger when we help each other out, when we share resources and advice and opinions.
Thank you.
That's wonderful advice. That's what we are all about, right? Sharing resources. Severin Roberts has a question. I think she wanted me to ask it from what I got. So the question is, can you describe a moment you recognize in your journey that changed your path and the decision led you into a leadership space?
Oh, I don't know if there was anything that led me into a leadership space. I mean, I think if most of the decisions that I make, whether as a community organizer or as a journalist, come from a place of rage. I'm usually reacting to my own anger at injustice, at imbalance, at inequity. And so I think it was really, those are the turning points. I remember being at a major photo festival in France the summer before I founded Women Photograph, and talking to a couple photo editors from a major magazine, and in semi-tactfully, probably not because I'm not very tactful, but in trying to sort of interrogate this person about why they weren't hiring more women, the response was, well, there just aren't that many women photographers. I would hire them if I knew where to find them. And so I literally went back to my Airbnb and started a Google form and a spreadsheet. And it was just like, fine, if you can't find them, I'm going to make a list, and then you can never say that ever again. So, that I think that tends to be the driving force. But I don't know if there was a specific turning. I mean, maybe that was the turning point. That was probably it.
You have mentioned several times now that you didn't study photography. So I want to go back to your decision to study architecture, and I'm curious if that has any impact on how you do photography, like any skills that you learned that have really shaped who you are as a photojournalist.
So I think my parents actually may have joined this Zoom call, so I have to word myself carefully here. I grew up the daughter of an immigrant from Vietnam who became a federal prosecutor at the Department of Justice. My father is a doctor. There was sort of very specific expectations as a sort of 1.5 generation American of what I should do. And so, I had to push back a little bit against that and say, well, there's this thing that I really want to do. And it took a little time. And so I think, architecture was maybe sort of a middle ground in the interim of having that conversation of it's, semi-respectable, but also visual. And it felt compelling to me. And from a pragmatic standpoint, I think it actually saved my education, because it may have been the only discipline at Columbia where all of my professors were working in the real world. They all had their own architecture practices. And so when I not so subtly would take a phone call from an editor and walk out of class to take an assignment, they just went, okay, she's figured out what she wants to do, great. Whereas if I had been studying history or poli-sci or econ, I think I would have been very abruptly failed from many of my classes. So I don't know, it's hard for me to measure how much it's impacted my work and the way I see. I'm sure it has some role to play just in I think there is at times something kind of structural and layered about my photography that may be tangentially related to that. But most of all, it gave me a space and time to become a photojournalist.
I think that is the end of the questions on our chat. Again, I want to give people an opportunity. If anybody else wants to ask questions, please go ahead and type them on the chat, or just type that you have a question and we will unmute you.
I think I see 2 more in the chat.
Oh, let me see. Maybe I am not seeing them. That's weird. Can you read the question and answer? I'm going to try and figure out what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's one from Eva Blackwell. Oh, sorry. Hi, Eva. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, actually, I did put it in the chat as well, but I was supposed to put an exclamation point, and it was just a backslash. But at any rate, I'm also a journalist, and I've been working on a number of different projects that are based on solutions journalism. And so some of the projects that you shared with us today certainly could open themselves up to that type of project. But I wanted to find out from you if there are any projects that you're currently working or look forward to working on in that genre.
Maybe not as explicitly as to what you're referring to, but I try to think of all of the projects that I work on in a solutions journalism context. And that may vary in terms of the sort of pragmatic success that they achieve, but I would love to I forgot to talk about this, but I would love to quickly plug a project that I co-founded with 5 colleagues called We Women Photo. I'll drop the link into the chat. And this is a collaborative group effort to document critical issues across the United States through the eyes of women and non-binary photographers. And every single project is rooted in solutions journalism and community engagement. So they all actively involve, I think one of the one of the things that I believe we need to evolve most in the way in which we do journalism is that it's deeply extractive. We go into a place, we literally take a story, we remove ourselves from that context, and then we share it to a broad audience. And sometimes that's necessary in some contexts, but most of the time the community gets absolutely no say, no involvement, no good from that story. And so We Women is actively working to combat that and involve the voices of the people being photographed and blur those lines between who exactly is the journalist and who is the subject, which is a word that I strongly dislike and hope we can start to screw up from our vocabulary. So that doesn't really answer your question about my work, but I do deeply believe in
the subject. What would you suggest?
People who are being photographed, something that specifically describes them. I think just subject is such it allows us to sort of distance ourselves from that person in such a clinical way. I find it to be a very sort of dispassionate word. So, and anything we can do to shift that, I think. And, I know that people first is becoming a sort of eye-rolling expression, but just anything we can do to just spend more time and energy describing the people who are being vulnerable with us and giving us their time and their stories, I think is worth that extra linguistic effort.
Wonderful. Elizabeth has another question that I love because it's about wardrobe. And there's a lot of fashion students at Stevens. And if you follow Daniella on Instagram, you can see that recently she posted a photo with a very cool snowsuit. So the question is, when you travel, what is the go-to wardrobe piece that always makes it in your backpack?
I don't know if there's a go-to wardrobe piece. I mean, as you can tell, I only ever am wearing black. That's the go-to. I will always have a scarf in my backpack because, it's always useful if you're working in conservative communities and you need to cover yourself up. If you're somewhere dusty or there's a sandstorm, you can protect yourself, for whatever reason. So there's always a scarf tucked into my bag, and I wrap my film camera in it. But I don't know that I have a go-to wardrobe item other than that. It also, I work in so many different environments that it radically changes. Right now I'm really into those little break hand warmers, just because I worked in the Arctic in September and realized how magical they are. And so now I'm never going to leave home without them. But yeah, I don't know that it changes so radically from project to project.
So, I mean, I can expand on that. I also only ever travel out of a backpack, and it drives me insane when I don't have the right clothes for the climate. And that's literally the reason that I'm now studying fashion design. So if you could design your perfect transformative piece of wardrobe, what do you wish you always had? Or
that's a really great
not a very good question, but
I mean, I guess the thing that all photojournalists are always in search of is pants that are comfortable and flexible and durable and warm and have a couple more women's pockets are just a total sham. And what? So, I would love a good pair of jeans, but made out of something that's maybe not denim, that won't absorb my sweat quite as much, that actually have deep pockets that I can put batteries and cards in. And I don't know, so some hybrid cargo pant that also doesn't look like a cargo pant. I think that maybe that's the answer.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks.
Stay tuned, Daniella. You never know what Stevens students are coming up with.
I'm ready. Maybe the first customer.
Next, we have Shashan.
Greetings, Daniella. Thank you for your time, treasure, and talents. So Stevens encourages folks in our ecosystem to dream up, specifically by learning, growing, and leading. So what is a dream? What's on your, ASER to-do list? I don't like life bucket, but, is there a collaboration? Is there a trip you want to take? So go put it in the universe and claim it.
That's a great question. It's been so hard during the pandemic to really think about those things. I've gone basically, last month I was able for the first time in a year to visit one of the many families that I've been documenting and, in sort of different long-term projects. But gosh, I don't know. I think there are two things on the horizon that are most urgent to me. One is the latter chapter of Signs of Your Identity. I spent 3 years in the United States interviewing elders who went through the boarding school system. I've been working in sort of my usual language of these black and white double exposures, but I've also been collaborating with 3 Native artists. One is a painter, one is an illustrator, one is a beadwork artist, where I've been sending them my portraits and they've been embellishing them themselves. And we were gonna have this big exhibit with all of the work together and get together and bring some of the survivors. And that's been indefinitely put on hold because of the pandemic. So I cannot wait until that's something that can happen. I think the other project that I'm still trying to figure out, there are some stories that feel and sound sexy because you can, in your mind's eye, you can kind of imagine what they look like. And so it's easy to pitch them and it's easy to get support. And sometimes it just doesn't click. And so there is a project, I want to continue that work that I did in Hawaii because I learned so much about sort of intra-Polynesian language revitalization and educational systems where communities have just completely broken down what we understand to be formal education. And they have rebuilt it in very culturally specific ways with the advice and guidance of elders. And it is so powerful and so beautiful, but it's really hard to pitch a story that's about education because everyone thinks, oh, students in a classroom at desks, and trying to say, no, it's like students in a forest and students in kayaks at sea, and it's totally different from what we know. So that's kind of on my wish list. So hopefully sometime soon.
Thank you. You'll do it. You're a history maker.
We are also opening or starting a business major at Stevens, and I know that a lot of our students have that creative outlet that they love, and they might be trying to merge that with business. So what general advice would you give to students who are interested in beginning their own photography business? And I imagine that will depend on which photography field they want to go in, but any general advice that you could give them?
Oh, I don't know that I'm the right person to answer this question. I love that idea. I think, photography can exist in so many different ways. And as the medium explodes, I can't remember now, but I looked up recently the statistic for the number of photographs that are now made every single year. And it's just bananas compared to if we think about how many photos were made in 1980 and 1970 and 1960. We're just producing billions and billions and billions of photographs now. And I think there are so many ways in which we can creatively and ethically make use of that. I guess that sentence hints at what I think, which is just, I think, the thing we have to think about most is centering. And obviously this isn't relevant for everyone, but for those of us who do photograph people, for those of us who are photographing in stories that are sensitive, we have to make sure that we're people first, and documentarians or business people or anything else second. I think that's another one of those historic ethical codes in photojournalism that has just always needed to change, is the sense of, we can't interfere, we can't involve ourselves in any way in the lives of the people we photograph. I think if someone is in a dire situation in front of you and you have the capacity to help them, I think you should help them. And, and that, I think in that same regard, any kind of business venture, I think there's so many exciting directions in which that could go, but I want to make sure that we also center humanity first, and that we make sure that we're being, good, ethical people.
Absolutely. That is such good advice. People first. So we are pretty much close to our end time for this meeting. I want to thank you so much. You have inspired us to think creatively, to be the spinach of documentary photography, the thing that is good for you, not what people want, or no, sorry, I got that wrong. It's what you need, even if you don't know that you need it. So thank you for all of your wonderful advice and sharing everything that you did with us. I know our students greatly appreciate it. So thank you so much. I don't know if President Lynch or Dr. Kopenhaver, if you have any last remarks that you would like to say before we leave.
I guess I would only say, Daniella, that I cannot imagine a better inaugural speaker for this very special event. It truly was inspiring and informative and challenging and thoughtful and so powerful coming from such an extraordinary woman. And we
Thank you so much.
Really appreciate you being here. I've been listening in awe. So we so
Thank you.
appreciate it. And if you can teach at Wake Forest, you could certainly teach adjunct at Stevens. Just saying.
I would love to.
Okay, we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much for having me. And students, if you have questions, if you want to reach out, please feel free. I just dropped my email into the chat. Sometimes I can be a little slow depending on where I am in the world, but I will always respond and always try to be helpful.
Thank you so much. We again really appreciate it. Thank you so much to you and everyone who made time to join us in this very exciting partnership.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.